France is deeply concerned at the number of civilian casualties in Gaza, which stands at several thousand. It condemns the attacks on United Nations sites on humanitarian personnel. Given the gravity of the humanitarian situation and the scale of the needs of the Gaza population, France calls for an immediate humanitarian truce. This truce must be durable and sustained. It is absolutely necessary and must lead to a ceasefire. Safe humanitarian access to the Gaza Strip must also be guaranteed in order to increase the number of humanitarian convoys. Given the urgency of the situation and at the initiative of President Emmanuel Macron, France is organizing an international humanitarian conference for the people of Gaza on November 9th in Paris. The aim is to coordinate international efforts to ensure that the international humanitarian response meets the needs of the Palestinians.
Look, we've been concerned about any kind of violence going on along the border with Lebanon, and we've said and we've made very clear that we do not want this war to spread. Okay, so we are working to try to make sure that it doesn't, because we think it's in no one's interest for that war to spread to Lebanon.
We call for an urgent humanitarian ceasefire. The Secretary General just made the same call this morning, a humanitarian ceasefire now. This is desperately needed to enable full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access, including for UN and humanitarian personnel, consistent with international humanitarian law. We urge all parties to take steps urgently towards a cessation of hostilities to ensure the protection of civilians. We demand that the parties to the conflict facilitate the continuous, sufficient, and unhindered provision of essential goods and services to all civilians throughout the Gaza Strip. These must include electricity, water, fuel, food, and medical supplies, sustained and at scale.
We condemn all violations of international humanitarian law, all violence against civilians, including all acts of terrorism and indiscriminate attacks. We condemn the 7th October attacks by Hamas on Israel. We also condemn the indiscriminate attacks by Israel on the Gaza Strip. We express our grave concern at the continued detention of hostages and demand the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, as well as their safety, well-being, and humane treatment consistent with international law. But the killing and maiming of children, attacks on schools and hospitals in the Gaza Strip, and denying children access to humanitarian assistance are all very grave violations against children. We call on all parties to fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law, including the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. We reiterate the need for the parties to take measures to ensure the safety and well-being of civilians and their protection, as well as humanitarian and medical personnel, UN personnel, and journalists. Wars have rules, and they must be upheld. Look, I think the gaps remain on what is achievable on the ground, where the political appetite is among some of the major players on this file, and the crisis on the ground as well. I think the most pressing need on the ground, which all council members have recognized, is the urgent humanitarian need. But I think the bigger problem, which also many council members have recognized, is that without a cessation of hostilities or some kind of humanitarian truce that is immediately implemented, far too many civilians have already lost their lives, and far too many more will continue to lose their lives unless that is put into place. But those are some of the parameters of where the gaps in the discussion exist, and I think the conversations are ongoing to try and have impact on the ground.